Hi there, welcome back to History 101. We are working again in Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we are in Part 2 of the lecture all about the monks' contributions to Western civilization. So we had already talked about how the monks contributed economically to Western Europe, especially agriculturally with many of their innovations, but in other ways as well, and that was in the previous lecture. Now what I want to take up is how they contributed to the religious life of Western Europe, as well as the intellectual and artistic or cultural life of Western Europe. So I want to start with the religious life. The monks, even though they wanted to be alone, right? Mono, monk comes from the word mono, meaning alone. And the early monks did start out basically as hermits, wanting to be alone and commune with God. Turns out that they figured, well, maybe we should all live together and commune with God. So we see the rise of monasteries in the West, starting, of course, with Benedict, who started the Benedictine monasteries in the West. And then we see that even though they may have wanted to just commune with God, they ended up really influencing and affecting the outside civilization as well. And one way they did this was certainly through their missionary activity. So I'm going to talk about 4 different people and their contributions or impact on Western Civ. The first of whom I'm pretty sure you've heard of, and that is St. Patrick. St. Patrick, many of you think of St. Patrick's Day and green beer and wearing green and so on, but he actually was not even Irish at all. Shocker, he was actually English. So St. Patrick was from England. He was actually kidnapped by Irish slave raiders, taken to Ireland, and kept in captivity there. He eventually escaped back to England, and then he decided to become a monk. And he became a monk and decided that his calling was really to go back to the people who had enslaved him and let them see the light, to bring them the word of God. So he went back over and started to preach. And the way he did it is he tried to appeal to the common people. He went out and preached to the masses. So a grassroots kind of taking hold of Catholicism. And when I say Catholicism, it's the same thing as Christianity. All through the Middle Ages, there's only one church. So today it would be the version that we call the Catholic Church. But back then, there was just one variety of Christianity. So he converts them, and we know that that stuck because obviously Ireland is still, at least part of Ireland, is still a very Catholic country today. So that's St. Patrick, who helped convert the Irish. Another example is St. Augustine, or Augustine, however you'd like to say him. And St. Augustine took a different approach. He was tapped to leave his home in North Africa, where he was a bishop, and to head on up to England. And in England, he said instead of going out among the masses, he figured if he just converted the leader, if he could get the King of Kent, one of the important leaders in England, to convert, then the King of Kent could by decree just say, all my subjects are now Christian. So he figured that might be a more efficient way to go, a top-down approach, if you will. And he did have success. He was able to convert the King of Kent, who then converted his subjects. In return, what the King of Kent did is he made St. Augustine the Bishop of Canterbury. And the Bishop of Canterbury, that position is going to be with us for a while. You'll be seeing it in later chapters. It is a religious position, obviously a high-placed bishop, but it also is going to be very much a political position as well. The Bishop of Canterbury will be an important political advisor for the King of England. So he was the first one of those. Another example of a missionary, she wasn't really a missionary, to tell you the truth. The next one I want to talk about is a woman named St. Hilda. And she's highlighted in your text as well, St. Hilda of Whitby Monastery. And she actually trained a lot of the monks to go out and be missionaries. So they went to her for training. She was considered a great teacher, and she taught many of them how to go about teaching others to try to bring the word to them. So St. Hilda of Whitby, another name to know. And you can read a little document in your book about her. And then finally, we have a guy named St. Boniface. And St. Boniface is famous for actually becoming a martyr because of his missionary activities. And I want to talk about him just to highlight how dangerous this could be. Some people did not want these guys showing up and trying to make them change their religion at all. And with St. Boniface, he ended up getting murdered for his trouble as he showed up, and some people didn't want to hear it. and that was the end of St. Boniface. He was trying to convert the Germanic tribes. But all in all, what we see is that the monks did have success in bringing a lot of those old kingdoms, like Ostrogoths, Visigoths, etc., Anglo-Saxons, a lot of them ended up switching over to Christianity, and then Christianity really becomes kind of the glue that holds Western civilization together. There's not much else they have going for it in the vacuum left by Rome, but we do have that one glue or that one kind of commonality that can help to unify all these disparate kingdoms in Western Europe now that there's not a big Roman Empire anymore to unify them. So their missionary work, very instrumental in unifying Europe under the dome of united Christendom. The final area in which the monks made a significant contribution, and it's actually my favorite one, is in the intellectual life of Western Europe. The only place really learning and a lot of deep thinking was really going on was in the monasteries themselves. If I lived in the Middle Ages, so I'd be like, sign me up, put me in one of those, because at least it's a place where you could read and you could learn. Okay? So the first topic I want to take up under intellectual life is something called Neoplatonism. And I hope that sounds a little familiar to you. Neo means new, and Platonism refers back to the ideas of Plato. So hopefully you remember from chapter 3, your reading and part of my lecture about Plato. What many of the people in the Middle Ages thought was that the ideas of Plato seemed to be able to mesh perhaps a little bit better with their Christian worldview than some of the other philosophers like Aristotle or Socrates. And the reason was that Plato had posited kind of this dualism. If you recall, he said there was this world, which was imperfect and changeable and so on. And then there was this other kind of world, what he called the world of ideas and forms, where the true essence of things really existed. So here we're just seeing basically shadows on the cave wall, not the real things, but pale imitations of them. But in this other world, you have the perfect examples of truth or beauty or justice or, of course, goodness. And that fits in well with the Christians because they could take this kind of dualism and they could say, well, yeah, see, that kind of fits in with our vision of earth, for instance, and heaven. That earth is this imperfect, changeable place, but heaven is an eternal, perfect place. So we do see a revival of the ideas of Plato in some sectors, and we call that Neoplatonism. Another thing I want to talk about are just some of the major players and their contributions. So I want to go back again to St. Augustine. We'd already mentioned him a minute ago with religious contributions when he was sent to England, but he also wrote two important works that would count under this intellectual contributions. And the first of which was called The City of God. And in it, he does do this Neoplatonist kind of representation of, he said, we have the city of the world, which is earth, which he said is kind of full of sinners, and there's evil, and there's wickedness, and there's a lot of bad stuff. But then there's the city of God, which is eternal, changing, perfect, and no sin anymore. So he uses Neoplatonism in that work. He also wrote another work, a much more personal work in many regards, called Confessions. And this was an account of his own conversion experience. And he writes about this in Confessions. It has been a model ever since. If you know Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he named his work in the 1800s Confessions as well, kind of as an homage, I guess, to Augustine. And if you watch any of these shows where people go on and air their dirty laundry, like, who can believe it? Like, who's the baby daddy or whatever? I think we can blame that all back on St. Augustine, who is the first one to say, I'm going to just lay it all out here, everything I've done wrong, and where I'm hoping to go from here on out. Okay. Then we have another guy named Bede. B-E-D-E, and he's also in your book for the spelling. And Bede wrote a very important book called The History of England. And it is still the best reference for a history of England in the Middle Ages that we have. If you want to know something about the history of England in the Middle Ages, you still go to Bede. So he was quite a scholar. He actually studied all kinds of things, history, philosophy, theology, etc. But that was his most famous work. Then we have a fellow named St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas is famous, well, for many things, but one of the things I want to discuss is that he tried to use philosophy, logic, and reason to try to prove that God exists. So he's famous for his 5 different proofs of God's existence. To us, this might seem a little strange, you know, like for most people, religion seems to be a matter of faith, right? It's not a matter of using reason and logic. You take a leap of faith and you believe or you don't believe. But for people in the Middle Ages, they were really trying to reconcile faith and reason. And he tried to come up using reason and logic to actually come up with a reasoned approach to reasons why God exists. And then finally, I want to talk about the monks' contributions to, one more guy, sorry, St. Jerome. Let's talk about Jerome for a minute. Jerome is an interesting one. He started out as a scholar, and he loved the ancients. He loved the Greeks and the Romans, and he read them all the time. But when he converted to Christianity, he started to feel that reading these pagan writers was wrong, and he should just be reading the Bible, right? He should just be reading the Old and New Testament. He shouldn't keep creeping over to read his Cicero or Herodotus or whatever. But he couldn't help himself because he really admired the ancients and so on. So what he eventually does is he becomes known as the guy who translates the Old and New Testament from the Hebrew and the Greek into Latin. And his version of the Old and New Testaments in Latin becomes the standard text then for hundreds of years. And that highlights something important about a lot of these monks and thinkers. Some of them said, well, the only book you need is the Bible. But others of them said, well, hold on a minute. Even though these Greeks and Romans were pagans, they still had some important stuff to teach us. We can still learn from them. And so this group of guys really made it a point to try to preserve the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, to preserve the classical intellectual tradition. And what they'd do is they would work in these libraries in the monasteries called scriptoria. And you'd have a scribe who would write the text, and then you'd have an illuminator who'd come in and decorate the works. And they are the ones who laboriously translated and also made copies of works, so that today we have, for instance, Aristotle's Poetics, that we have Herodotus, the Persian Wars, or Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars. They're the ones who saved Procopius. They're the ones who saved Sophocles for us, or Aristophanes. So it was due to these monks working away laboriously, translating and copying the works of the ancients, that we actually have these guys today. Because the monks were the only ones who seemed to care about the ancients and their intellectual tradition. So philosophy, literature, history. Thanks, monks. Speaking of these books, I had mentioned that the monks sometimes sold these books as well, so they would copy and translate. And what you'll notice is that in the margins, the monks would make doodles, sometimes called marginalia. And sometimes these marginal comments or pictures are just scenes of everyday life. You know, women shopping or people pushing a plow, something like that. Which we can learn a lot from. You can learn about customs and dress and food and trade and all that from these little marginal pictures, really only rediscovered as actually important sources in the last 40 years. However, one of the other things the monks kept putting in the margins were sometimes these bizarre little pictures, and some of them were actually pornographic. A lot of times they'd love to have sharp objects pointed at hindquarters, pillows at hindquarters, nude nuns and priests, sometimes even showing sexual acts. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, who knew? I thought they were doing the serious work of translating Greek, Roman, and religious text, and margins are telling us a different story. Well, some have supposed that maybe sometimes the people who were buying the books actually asked for certain marginalia, so that they were actually, in a sense, selling pornography, but under the guise of these other important works. I did post an extra article. If you're interested in the marginalia of illuminated manuscripts, you can take a look at that. That's an optional video for you, or excuse me, an optional article that you can read about that. I did post a video, which is a required video, that shows you how an illuminated manuscript is made. And you'll see that this was a pretty long, intensive process for them to actually make one of these illuminated or illustrated manuscripts. Okay, that does us for the monks and their contributions to Western Civ. I'll see you again back in Chapter 8 next week.